4. Urgency, when speed fractures across borders. Urgency is one of the most deceptively complex signals a leader can send. Many executives imagine urgency as a simple instruction, a call to accelerate, to give something priority, to move quickly. They assume that urgent is a shared concept, a universally understood tempo that requires no further explanation. But urgency is not a neutral term. In multicultural environments, urgency is emotional, psychological, and deeply cultural. The moment urgency enters a message, it stops being a matter of speed and becomes a matter of interpretation. If tone is the emotional atmosphere of communication, urgency is its weather system. It changes the pressure in the room. It shifts attention, heightens sensitivity, and activates instinct. And as with weather, different climates react differently. What feels like a brisk breeze in one region may feel like a storm in another. A global operations director once told me he could always tell when a crisis was unfolding, not by the content of the emails he received, but by how his teams interpreted the word urgent. The word traveled through his organization like a dye released into water, spreading and tinting behaviors in ways he had never intended. His European teams became more deliberate, his American teams sped ahead before confirming details, his Asian teams paused, waiting for absolute clarity. Some regions escalated minor issues reflexively. Others remained silent until the situation became unmanageable. He described it like this: urgency behaved like completely different instructions depending on where it landed. It wasn't urgency anymore, it was amplitude. It turned up the emotional volume in each region, but each region heard a different pitch. His experience reflects a broader truth: urgency does not communicate one thing. It communicates many things simultaneously, and the meaning depends on the listener's cultural logic. In some cultures, urgency is synonymous with action. The instruction urgent is taken as permission to move immediately, even if details are incomplete or solutions are imperfect. This instinct reflects a belief that it is better to take initiative in the face of uncertainty than risk delay. Teams raised in these environments see urgency as a call to show leadership through speed. Elsewhere, urgency signals danger. Urgent instructions are interpreted as a moment to reduce risk, not increase it. Speed becomes secondary to certainty. Teams slow down, double-check details, and ensure that every step is correct before proceeding. In these cultures, urgency is not a race, it is a warning. It indicates heightened stakes and therefore heightened caution. Still others interpret urgency relationally. They ask themselves whom the urgency might affect, whom it might pressure, whom it might inconvenience. They balance the task with the emotional impact on stakeholders. Urgency becomes an act of diplomacy rather than an act of speed. It is not that any interpretation is wrong. Each interpretation makes perfect sense within its cultural logic. But when urgency travels through an organization containing all these logics simultaneously, misalignment becomes inevitable. I once observed a leadership call during which a senior vice president addressed a potential client issue. His words were simple: "We need to move urgently on this." The silence that followed was brief but telling. In that moment, the organization split into its internal geographies of meaning. One region immediately began drafting solutions. Another prepared a risk analysis. A third contacted the customer proactively, assuming that urgent meant the relationship needed immediate reassurance. A fourth held back entirely, waiting for explicit instructions, believing that acting too quickly might make the situation worse. The vice president ended the call feeling confident that he had been clear. What he had actually done was trigger 4 incompatible behaviors with a single sentence. Urgency also changes when pressure rises. Under stress, urgency becomes magnified, and emotional interpretations intensify. A leader who speaks with a tone of measured urgency may find that their message lands as panic in one region and indifference in another. A short, efficient message may feel like pressure to a team that values harmony or thoroughness. A firm instruction meant to stabilize may feel overwhelming to a region that relies on consensus. Under pressure, urgency does not simply distort, it accelerates, often beyond a leader's visibility. This is why urgency is one of the earliest indicators of drift. Not because the leader has miscommunicated, but because urgency leaks into the emotional foundations of the organization. People begin to act not from the words they heard, but from the emotional meaning they assigned to those words in their own context. The leader imagines they have communicated a shared priority. The organization experiences a surge of interpretive fragmentation. One of the most striking examples of this came from a global engineering firm dealing with a sudden regulatory change. Leaders communicated the change with what they believed was a calm sense of importance. But in regions where regulatory compliance carries severe consequences, important was interpreted as urgent, and urgent was interpreted as critical. Teams began escalating minor details reflexively. Meanwhile, in regions where regulatory environments are more flexible, the same message was interpreted as an invitation to gather additional information, leading to delays. The leadership team was baffled. How could the same message lead to both hyperactivity and hesitation? The answer lay in the emotional meaning of urgency. For some, urgency triggered a desire to act immediately. For others, it triggered a need for careful analysis. The organization was not misaligned because it misunderstood the message. It was misaligned because it felt the message differently. This is the heart of urgency's complexity. Urgency reveals not what people think, but what they fear. And fear is not evenly distributed across cultures. Some cultures fear acting too slowly, others fear acting too quickly. Some fear making mistakes, others fear being passive. Some fear disappointing leadership, others fear overstepping authority. Urgency activates these fears instantly, shaping behavior in ways that the leader cannot see unless they look for the emotional pattern behind the response. Global organizations do not fail because people disagree on what urgent means. They fail because people do not know that others interpret urgency differently. This silent divergence is what produces the sudden sense of chaos leaders often feel when they believe they've been perfectly clear. They are watching the acceleration of emotional interpretation, not the failure of logic. To lead effectively across cultures, executives must recognize that urgency is not an instruction. It is a state of mind. It is not a tempo, it is an emotional signal. And like all emotional signals, it must be stabilized before it can be shared. This does not mean eliminating urgency. It means defining it not in operational terms, but in emotional ones. Leaders must communicate not only what needs to be done quickly, but what kind of quickly they mean. They must clarify whether urgency requires initiative, caution, escalation, alignment, or creativity. They must understand how urgency will land in the emotional landscapes of different teams. When urgency is stabilized, organizations move together. When urgency is not stabilized, organizations move apart. The next chapter explores what happens after tone and urgency collide, when teams begin to act in ways that make sense to them but no longer align with each other. It is here that behavioral drift begins to reveal itself more visibly, even though its roots are deeply emotional.